Thanks everyone for joining us for our uranium event today. We have a keynote by Warren Irwin, who's CIO and founder of Rosseau Asset Management and a longtime investor in the uranium space. He's going to give us a bit of an overview on the uranium markets and have a little bit of a chat of what's going on. Hi, Warren. Thanks for volunteering to do the keynote today.
Well, thanks for having me, Deborah.
Always a pleasure. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an update on what's going on with the uranium markets right now.
Yeah, well, we've, as you know, I've been re-engaging in the uranium market probably about 6 years ago when I got involved in the early stages of NextGen's big discovery in the Western Athabasca. And in the early days, everybody thought that, we actually had some of our competitors calling NextGen a fraud. It was baloney. It doesn't exist. And over the last 5 or 6 years, obviously, it's been proven up that it's an extraordinary deposit. I remain a shareholder, although not as big as I was originally. At one point, I was over 10% of NextGen, and I've gradually sold over the last 5 or 6 years. So that's sort of my biggest activity here in the uranium space. And over that last 5 or 6 years, I've done a lot of research on uranium and how it's changed from the previous cycle. In the previous cycle, I was very active in South America, in Africa. I was involved in Namibia with the HUSAB. We sold that. I was involved with, co-invested with Polo. We sold that to the Chinese. I was also involved in global uranium in Niger, and also with other projects in Niger, also with U3O8 when they were exploring in Guyana. I've been involved in other African countries also, and I've looked for uranium, around the world at various places. But one great thing about it, especially given the panel you have today, is when you look around the world, and Kazakhstan produces, the rough numbers, approximately 40% of the world's uranium right now, which has really changed quite a bit since the last uranium cycle. It's fascinating how they've come up with such massive production, and the markets has sort of absorbed it over the years. And now price of uranium is a little stronger. We're in the low 50s. As you know, we got into the 60s not that long ago. And but going forward, I think the biggest theme here, there's a couple of really big themes that I'm following. One is when I spoke with Al Gore at the TED conference in Vancouver, probably about 5 years ago, he looked at me as if I had three heads when I said, okay, all well and good, wind power and solar, what about uranium? And he had no response. He has never been asked that question. And when people came up with the stupid name renewables, I don't know what renewables have to do with anything, really. Renewables is the dumbest name in the world, because you should have uranium in there. And then you'll have people say, well, uranium's not renewable. And I say, well, is the sun renewable? The sun will eventually burn out. Is it renewable? Or, well, it's not going to burn out for a very long time. I say, well, we're not going to run out of uranium in this world for a very, very long time. I remember last uranium cycle, we had firms, and this will happen this next uranium cycle if prices get to the crazy levels, certainly inflation adjusted of the past cycle. I think people have run inflation adjusted numbers, and we're looking at peak last cycle was around the equivalent to today's inflation adjusted number, around $200 a pound. And I remember back then, the technology then to extract the uranium from seawater was around the $200, $250 a pound level. So there is, with uranium, as with some other metals, there is a cap at which we have an unlimited supply of uranium that we could take from seawater, but we're quite a ways away from that. But that, for people who are calling for crazy numbers like $5,000 or $1,000 a pound uranium, it's not going to happen. There is a cap long term. And that is the seawater extraction. So meanwhile, we're running around the world looking for high-grade uranium, or as high-grade as we could find, right? So now that the characters like Al Gore and some of the others have watched the disasters both in Texas and in Germany, where Germany's blown $1 trillion on the Al Gore renewables, wind and solar, or the people in the UK who've just watched their wind die down over the winter and weren't generating nearly the amount of wind power they needed to generate electricity. And then you also saw what happened with Texas when you had ice building on top of the the wind turbines, and everybody in Texas froze. Well, the reality is the only option for us going forward as a species on this earth is based on the technology we have is nuclear energy and uranium. If you work out all the math of our nuclear needs or our electrical needs going forward, we need nuclear power. It's the only thing that'll provide stable, non-CO2 generating power. So finally, the clowns like who have been behind renewables, pushing wind and solar, they are starting to figure out that there's a piece missing in that puzzle, and the Europeans are starting to figure it out. It is nuclear power. So that's the first step of the game. The Chinese are smart enough; they figured it out. They're already building many tens of reactors right now, and globally, there's about 50 under construction, and that's off a base of around 440. If you do the math on any projections of EVs, it's all well and good to have electric vehicles running around, but if you're firing them up with coal-fired energy to power these EVs, that's not going to help the world, right? So we need baseload, non-CO2 generating power, and we've dammed up all the rivers, and so we can't be doing that anymore. So we've got nuclear as an option. Nuclear has been grinding away since the 70s on a big scale basis. In the 70s was the biggest previous build out of nuclear power plants in the 70s in the US. 3 Mile Island brought that to a quick halt. And then you had all the environmentalists who jumped on the bandwagon screaming nuclear is bad. And you've seen it all in the old footage. And I've seen advertisements from the 70s where, wind and solar are only answers. And you read the small print at the bottom, sponsored by the Thermal Coal Society of, wherever. And so the thermal coal producers, who were the biggest losers on the switch to nuclear power, were very, very supportive of Greenpeace and others in their efforts to shut down nuclear and create a lot of hype about nuclear. But here we are, half a century later. There have been accidents. Chernobyl was, ridiculous nonsense that caused that. And then you have the major design flaw that wasn't, supervised well enough in Fukushima. And 3 Mile Island was really a non-event. So we've had a very, very safe last half century to prove that nuclear, even under light water technology, has been extraordinarily safe. There have been fewer people killed with nuclear energy than with hydro. And around the world, there have been hydro dams collapsing all the time, wiping out villages and killing hundreds of people downstream. Nuclear has not caused that. And what excites me about nuclear energy going forward, and hence demand for uranium, is the next generation or Gen 4 reactors. And I'm especially concerned about safety because I believe, I think that's one of the main reasons that people have been afraid of nuclear energy, despite their safe track record in the last half century. So the small modular reactors are really exciting, but I like the molten salt reactors. Their fuel is already melted down, so meltdown can't happen, and they are fail safe. So I'm looking forward to some of the new Gen 4 reactors that'll get implemented, and there's some SMRs being built, just started to be built and permitted around the world. That's exciting. The big travesty for mankind has been the environmental groups that have been fighting and remain to fight nuclear energy, which is like Greenpeace is, poster child for that. They were the ones all over nuclear energy in the 70s. They're still anti-nuke right now. Some of the founders of Greenpeace have quit Greenpeace and gone out and said, hey, nuclear energy is the way to go. It's obvious. It's the only way we're ever going to supply the power the world needs. But organizations like Greenpeace have put nuclear research certainly back half a century. So we have a lot of catching up to do. But in the meantime, Gen 4, pretty exciting. And some of these new SMRs, small modular reactors, are going to be very interesting. I also heard of programs where, the U.S. Army is researching super small reactors to replace diesel power generators on some of their more remote locations. And so there's really, really exciting future for uranium, in my opinion.
That's interesting. We hit on a number of the themes that, we wanted to talk about, which are the EV revolution and the problems of the grid and stability of energy supply. I think it's interesting uranium being baseload, whereas a lot of the other renewables, as you call them, or more environmentally friendly options are not. So they are unable to supply a steady stream of power to the grid. So I think that's part of the EV revolution that doesn't make sense to me is people want to buy these cars and they want to plug them in and they think they're getting some sort of clean energy power, but a lot of it's dirty. And also the grid's not equipped to handle a lot of the EVs that are coming on. So it's interesting that uranium can potentially solve that problem. The small modular ones are really interesting. I think I read an article that some of them are being built in Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah. There's a few. I'm not 100% sure on the permitting because it just changes all the time. I know that I have a friend of mine who's involved in building SMRs, and they were involved in with Ontario Hydro for the past several years, working on some next gen reactors with Ontario Hydro, and I believe they came in second place. But I knew their technology was pretty amazing. So I'll see what the number. We'll learn more about the winner of that challenge and how they'll come out with it. I forget which one won it, but it was one of the big ones, like a Westinghouse equivalent or something like that. That won the battle for Ontario Hydro for the next gen reactors, and they'll be pretty exciting. And SMRs. There's various places around the world that are building. I believe China's got one going, but it's changing daily, and they're being approved all the time. And it'll be interesting to see how the trials with the SMRs work out.
Especially the small ones that you referenced. I hadn't heard that before. But one of the things that I find kind of interesting is all these mining companies are chasing, ESG and getting ESG points and increasing their ESG rating. I think that's one of the reasons that we've seen some acquisitions in British Columbia of mining assets. It's, I think, the cleanest source of energy in the world because it's mostly hydro. But if you can provide another clean source of energy for mining companies, whether it's by a grid powered by or a system powered by uranium or one of those small generators, I think that could really benefit mining companies. What do you think about that?
No, I'm a big fan of that. I'm hoping we get to a day. Can you believe this? If like this is me as an environmentalist thinking out long term. I'm hoping we get to the day where the nuclear energy is viewed as so safe, so portable, and so reliable that there is a day where you and I will see the explosions as we remove the dams from the rivers that we've destroyed over the years by damming them up, right? So people say, hydro doesn't have pollution. Yeah, the ones we've already destroyed the rivers and killed all the fish and destroyed the habitat and all that stuff. Well, yeah, there's not a lot of that, but it would be good for me to see that, see some of these rivers originally restored to their original flow patterns and that sort of thing. I'm not sure it'll happen. Hydro has a long life. They're long life assets, but we'll see how low we can get the cost of nuclear power. As many people know, the key about nuclear power and how it differs from a lot of other sources, certainly of greenhouse gas and generating power, is if you look at a natural gas cogen plant where they're generating electricity from burning natural gas, the fuel is by far. The cost of the natural gas is by far the largest input cost. Where with uranium, the biggest cost on a nuclear reactor in generating electricity is the capital cost, and the fuel cost, depending, it's around the 5% level. It's a low single digits, right? So the cost of the fuel is not the major determinant, really, of the cost of electrical power out of the nuclear power plants, and that's why these small modular reactors are so revolutionary in that they standardize parts. Let's say we get one of the big manufacturers to standardize on a 300 megawatt power plant. Well, guess what? All the parts are standardized, and if you crank off 50 of them, there will be part centers in North America with parts for those 50 SMRs. There will be standard produced versus the current way we produce nuclear power plants is generally, we do a clean slate design. The design and engineering costs are huge. And then the capital expenditures are huge because you're also looking at a lot of customization, custom parts. So it's like building a custom house versus a subdivision house. Subdivision houses are way cheaper because you just rattle them off. They use the standard design and standard parts, standard sinks. Whereas, if you're building something custom, you're looking at something in from China, South America, Italy, France, and it's the standardization of nuclear power plants for any of the new ones going forward will be a major ability to for uranium energy producers to reduce their costs.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the macro stuff. Our events in support of a charity helping a family that we know in Ukraine being displaced to Poland, hopefully coming to Canada one day. So I'd be remiss to not talk about what's going on in Eastern Europe. What do you think about, I'm not going to ask you what you think about the Russian invasion, but how does it impact the uranium markets?
Well, I think the first thing that has happened, and Putin may or may not realize this, and Russian people may not realize this, is no matter what happens, things are not going to go back to the way they were. Finally, Europe will figure out that all the Russian gas and Russian energy they relied on is not a reliable source of energy for them and an energy source they don't want to use. And at some point, I've been singing this from the rooftop for a very long time. I says, I cannot believe the biggest consumer of uranium, the US, to power their fleet, is relying on Kazakhstan to supply those reactors. It's, in my opinion, it's been outrageous that it's even happened. And today it's proven how outrageous it is. I see in the future, demand for Western uranium will go up and there will be a premium for Western uranium. And I think what will happen then is the Chinese will take the place of North America purchasing uranium, and they'll buy it from the Kazakhs. So we'll have to have to segregate, I think, the supply chain, and that's why it's so exciting that we have some recent very interesting discoveries like ISO and NextGen in the Athabasca Basin. Because if I'm a U.S. power consumer, consumer of uranium and a power producer, even if I'm president of the U.S. or U.S. head of Department of Energy, we would need allies that provide us uranium. And Canada is the closest ally, the U.S.'s best ally. We would be, especially with the new Arrow deposit on stream, we'll be able to supply a significant portion of their energy. Also, it's generally in a normal uranium market, it's Kazakhstan, Australia, and Canada are the biggest producers. So the U.S. in Europe should be relying on Canada and Australia to supply a lot of those needs. As you know, France has a very close relationship with Niger and sources a significant amount of their uranium from Africa, Central Africa. So it'll be more and more important for nuclear energy power plant owners to source uranium from non-Kazakh production, in my opinion, going forward.
You referenced liking the Athabasca Basin for a number of reasons other than just security of supply of uranium. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what makes that region so attractive.
The reason I like investing there, Saskatchewan is viewed as usually in any survey by any of the think tanks out there, it's ranked usually 1 or number 2 mining jurisdiction, best mining jurisdiction in the world. That's the most important thing. When you're operating in the Athabasca Basin, you don't need to talk about human rights. You don't need to talk about you don't need to talk about corruption. You don't need to talk about a lot of the issues that plague, let's say, some countries in Africa. And so it's a good, solid, decent place to work with a lot of expertise. The people of Saskatchewan are fantastic people. Mining is in their culture, in their heritage. The Athabasca Basin, we've been mining it forever. And what's really exciting about it going forward is, especially in the western part, southwestern part, where NextGen's made their discovery, is one of the challenges we've had in the past through Cameco is that Cameco's mines are some of the most complicated mines I've ever I've ever examined. Cigar Lake requiring, needing to utilize jet boring, and McArthur River raised boring. They're in, and they also need a lot of freeze walls, and they're in a sloppy section of the underground in at the unconformity between sort of the sandstone and the basement rocks. It's a very difficult place to mine. You have water issues and you have ground control issues, and they've been very smart and very wise in producing a lot of new technology which allows them to mine this. So what's exciting about NextGen is that they're in the basement rocks, and I think in the past people poo-pooed finding big deposits in the basements. They thought basements were just leaking uranium off the unconformity, which is where the bulk of the historical deposits have been found. So it's very exciting to see a massive deposit like NextGen being found, and it can be mined considerably easier than that of Chemico. And I think there's substantial amount of exploration potential, not only on NextGen's ground in the western part of the basin, but also in some of the neighboring properties. And over the next few decades, it'll be very exciting to see what they're able to find there and how that impacts Canada's production of uranium, because it's a very, very exciting time, I think, over the next few decades in the Athabasca Basin, especially given that the whole western end of it is opened up now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into some of the company presentations that we've got lined up. Thanks so much for your time, Warren. Always a pleasure.
Deborah, thanks for having me, and have a great conference, and go Ukraine.
Thanks, Warren.
Thank you.